Hello guys, this is part 2 of making this Venice street, and this time we're going to be looking at the texturing of the different buildings and the different techniques that I used. So you can see that without any UVs, so you can see this object. This here only has default UVs, which are kind of messed up. You can see this one still has the UV from the cube. You can see it's around 16 or 32 vertices. This is obviously more than that. So I haven't done any UVs. You can see this is just a single line. Oh, maybe not. It's still using the default UVs, but the texturing technique I'm using doesn't require you to have any UVs, so I can just drop the same texture here. Just need, okay, sorry, gone on the other building, and the texture will be applied to that building. So if I added, say I created another building, and maybe let's say in this shape here, I can still apply the same texture without UV unwrapping that building. So let's dive into the texturing part of this tutorial series and get to it. And the other thing about this is that if you wanted, say, to scale, maybe to expand this building here, you can see, I don't know if it is updating as fast as I think in the viewport, in the recording screen, but you can see this. Yeah, you can easily make out expand the building without stretching the textures, and do this. And so let's dive in and see how I managed to do this. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is add a principal shader, then add an image texture, and then use the shortcut Ctrl T to add the mapping and UV coordinates nodes. So for this, you will need the node wrangler add-on enabled, otherwise you won't be able to use the shortcuts. So enable that, and then you can use the shortcuts. Then in the image texture, you need to change the projection from flat to box mapping. That is the only way you'll be able to use to see the textures without UV unwrapping the models. And yeah, so from that you also need to change the vector node from the UV coordinates from UV to object, and then connect that, make sure that is connected to the image texture, to the vector input of the image texture. So I'm still trying to add the background image for my lighting, for the HDRI lighting of my scene. And basically I also used added an image texture to the displacement. So I don't know why this happens a lot, but whenever I use a normal map and displacement map, one of the two doesn't work. So you can see that I'm having difficulties here using the normal map. I think here it's because I forgot to connect the UV coordinates from the map UV coordinate mappings from to connect the UV coordinate mappings. If you don't connect them, this won't work. So you can see here I'm correcting that and connecting it to have the mapping work. And you can see I just need to change the projection to box mapping to have that appear. But whenever I'm using the displacement mapping, the displacement map and normal map, I always get some artifacts that you can see there. I don't know if you can see them, but so now I've disconnected the displacement mapping to try out the bump mapping node that lets you mix the normal map and the displacement map to see if I can use both maps. But still I was getting these artifacts, one of the two, either the normal map or the displacement map was not working. So I decided after to just only use the normal map Uh, that way I can get the details that come with that. And you can see me now. I'm trying to mix. What was I mixing here? Yeah, the ambient occlusion from the for the break texture to get those. I don't know how they call them. The patterns to be more pronounced. Uh, so I add a color ramp so what I want to do here is separate that green algae that you see at the bottom. So I'm using a gradient texture and then flipping it using the texture coordinates. I think I use the 90 degrees in the Z axis so that I can rotate it vertically and then use the color ramp to determine the contrast between. So I'll be using this as a mask to mask the two textures, the brick texture and green algae. So I'm also adding a noise texture here to kind of add some kind of I don't know, because right now you see that it's like almost a flat horizontal line, but I want to add in some kind of organic distortion, whatever you want to call it. So I'm just trying to experiment with different ways to mask out so that I can combine that mask, the noise mask with the gradient mask, so that I have some kind of distortions instead of having a straight line. Yes, you just see what I'm doing here. So as you can see, I'm not always sure what values to use. So there is always a lot of experimenting you have to do when it comes to things like this. As you can see, I'm flipping around these colors to see which one would work best. And I think this is what I went with. You see, instead of having one flat line, I can use that the noise texture gives it some kind of variance, a variation, so that it's not just one flat line like that. Yeah, again, I'm using a mix color node to mix between the gradient and noise texture. Okay, so I think I was satisfied with the mask that I want to use, and so now it's time to bring in the green algae texture. So I drop that in and mix it with the break texture, and I use the mask that we have just created as the factor there. I see the green algae is not properly being applied because the texturing was still set to flat, so I had to change it to box shading. Remember, we're not using box projection. Remember, we're not using any UV mapping. That's why we need to change that to from UV to from flat projection to box projection. Okay, here so that the normal mapping was not working, so I changed that to the bump map. I switched to the bump mapping because I also want to mix the noise, the algae texture, so that it can also affect the bump mapping on the bricks, on the texture. And let's see. So yeah, you can see from the reference image, it's not just one texture. There is a brick texture. There is also I don't know how that is called, a wall that is not great. No, that's not brick texture. So So what I did is I grouped the node. You just use the shortcut Control G. You select all the nodes you want to group and then group them have them into one node so that your workspace is a bit cleaner. And now I'm trying to make that wall texture. So again, I found a texture map I wanted to use, but instead of using the color map directly from that, you'll see it in a few seconds here. I use that. I use the texture itself as a mask, and because I wanted to have control over the colors that I use, so you can see I'm adding a principal shader. That is, I'll be mixing these two shaders. I remember we already have the brick texture shader that we'll be mixing with this new texture. So I'm using a color mix node, and I'm also adding some ambient occlusion to the shader that way, so that the corners of the objects have more dark edges, dark corners. Again, I wanted to use the texture as a mask instead of a color map. So that's why I'm adding the color ramp, and so using that as a factor in the mix RGB node. So I also wanted to copy the bump mapping from the brick and apply it here, but for some reason it didn't copy. So I kind of left that for a second. So you can see I'm going between the two shaders. I remember the last shader we created, I've grouped it into a group node, but you can always go back to that using the tab key to switch back between the group node and the other node. So I'm using a mix shader to mix between these two shaders, and you can see now we have that. And if you set the value to 1, the factor value to 1, you'll see one shader. If you set it to 0, you'll see a different shader. But instead of using that, I'll just use a mask. Here you can see I'm copying the gradient mask we used to mask out the green algae. And I'm going to be using that as our new mask. Okay, you can see now, but the problem now is that the bricks are being covered. So what I did is I move the gradient mask a bit so that I can reveal the brick textures. You can see how the mask looks. So I'm also bringing out the noise texture a bit so that I can have some of the wall texture come through the brick, because I would imagine that the top wall texture was eroded due to weather to reveal that brick texture. That's why you see some parts of it are being on top of the bricks. Yeah, so here I wanted to bring, I'm creating the bump map of the bricks and combining it with the bump map of the wall, so that I can have two bump maps that I'll be mixed so that I can use them as the final bump map in the displacement node of the shader. So to control the amount of bumping, I added a math node and changed the operation to multiply, and so that I can have control over the amount of bump map that. Yes, so I think this is the final. I don't remember if this is what but you can see how we managed to get 3 different textures onto one object without even using any UV mapping. So you can also because you didn't use any UV mapping, you can apply the same material to a different object, and you don't really have to do any UV unwrapping. You just drop it onto another object and it will work perfectly. So you can see I just select the other building and apply the same material. So in the next tutorial, I'll be showing you a way to make a variation between the different colors, like you see in the reference image. Some buildings have some reddish paint on them, and each building has a unique color of its own. So I didn't want to go through the process of making the water again, because I did that in the previous tutorial. You can see how I did that. So I just copied that image and applied it here, but for some reason the textures were not rendering correctly. Only the reflections or the shader was rendering, but the image textures that bring up the bump mapping in the water were not coming through for some reason. I think it was a bug or something. So here you can see I'm trying to play around to see that to see a way if I can bring those bump maps back again. And also when you go to solo mode, sometimes the image, the object you try to solo, everything disappears. So you need to come back out of solo mode. So I think it's called isolated mode or something. So I tried closing Blender and reopening it to see if the textures come back, because that sometimes fixes the issues, but this time around it didn't. So I tried to remake the texture. Yeah. So from here on, most of what I do is the same thing over and over. It's just changing a few things and playing around with different settings and to make sure that things work the way I expected them to work. So yeah, I will let you watch the rest of the video. If you want the project files, I'll be uploading them on my CG Trader account or my Patreon account if you want to get them there. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe.